Welcome to Vital for Colorado Radio. I am your on-air producer, Jon Ekstrom. Joining me, as always, is our host. He is the chairman and CEO of Vital for Colorado, also an attorney at Robinson Waters and Ordorcio, Peter Moore.
John, thanks a lot. We are very honored today to talk about Proposition 112, and we have the research fellow for Vital for Colorado, Simon Lomax, and he knows a lot. So it's going to be a great show to really talk about what Proposition 112 is,
right.
All the people that oppose it and why they oppose it, including, I believe, both gubernatorial candidates and 50-plus elected officials, and on it goes, and why.
Simon, welcome.
Hey, thanks, John. Thanks, Peter.
It's nice to see you outside the boardroom. We'll call this one a home game.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Simon, I know your background, but you have a particularly interesting background. Just so people know who you are, just in brief, what is your background?
So I got started as a reporter back in Australia, where I grew up, and I was a reporter for about 15 years. And I split that time between Australia and the United States. I came to this country in 2002. And I spent most of my reporting career covering energy and environmental policy in Washington, working for, trade press and business news outlets. And most notably, I suppose, the outlet that most of your listeners have heard of was Bloomberg News.
Right.
And so I was there for about 3 years during the beginning of the Obama administration and covered all of their energy and environmental initiatives.
I think of you as having worked for Murdoch and then Bloomberg.
That's right.
And along the way, you're a small-town city editor in Mississippi, and they just must have loved an Australian in your accent there.
Well, I loved that time that I spent in the Deep South working. I was the city editor for a while. I covered, county board of supervisors and city council and school boards and everything, and it was a really good preparation for going to Washington, D.C. It really kind of grounded me in the kind of politics that really matter to people, as opposed to all of the kind of the noise and the sound and the fury that you see kind of on cable TV and all that kind of stuff.
Well, one of the old cliches is all politics is local, but I mean, in your case, it was a very tangible way that all politics was local. Yeah, for sure. It absolutely was. And, something that I learned as a reporter in a small town setting that has stayed with me all through my reporting career, but even now as an advocate working on, business issues and especially focusing on the energy sector here in Colorado, is the role of economic development and how important it is, and how, public officials and regular citizens really don't take it for granted. Jobs and investment, wages, tax revenues. When you're in a small town and a new industrial prospect is coming, that's a big deal. And I covered a couple of different manufacturing prospects, and one that they actually landed. It was an aerospace company. And it was such a learning experience for me because I had grown up in a pretty big city.
Was this a small town down by Huntsville?
It was Columbus, Mississippi, in northeast Mississippi, okay. Not too far from Tupelo to the north, and just across the line from Tuscaloosa in Alabama. Right. And they did have an aerospace center at Mississippi State University in Starkville, and that was one of the reasons why they located. Well, one of the things that you mentioned cued me, Peter, we do this sometimes where we'll throw out old movies. I don't know if you remember the Michael Keaton vehicle from 1983 or so, Gung Ho. I do, yeah. A movie that's a sentimental favorite of mine, but that town was dying. And Michael Keaton said when the underwear factory closed, then, we need something. We got a lot of workers. We have the factories. We are ready. And came in, revitalized the town, a couple of cultural struggles aside. Right. And, madcap hilarity also ensued. But your point is well taken. Yeah. So
it just doesn't have a magic. It happens by hard work. And once you have it, everybody's trying to take it away from you. And if you lose it, you'll never even know what you missed.
Yeah. And I think that the
board of business leaders that you've built for Vital for Colorado, you know, I've listened to them talk a lot about how much hard work has actually gone on in the last 20 or 30 years in Colorado to, you know, make sure that, you know, public policy and economic development is really a game of addition. So you're always looking to add new sectors, you're looking to add new companies, you're looking to add diversity to the economy. You're always looking to build on what you already have, rather than you know, taking certain industries for granted, or trying to push some industries out, you know, which is something that we are starting to see more of from activist groups.
And why we're here today.
Exactly.
You and I go back a ways, and when we were doing some advocacy for a number of companies, we talked about the DJ Basin quite a bit.
Yes, sir.
And one of the things that senior VPs told us is the DJ Basin in the 70s and 80s was a place where you'd go where you were sort of dragooned out there, right? Mm-hmm. And it was a static basin. You know, we're talking about J sand wells. They're very uncomplicated to drill, and you know, there's not a lot of complexity there. But the DJ Basin has reinvented itself a number of times, and where we find ourselves today is in a place of innovation and technological advancement, and that is at risk with Proposition 112.
And a lot of it's actually been advancement on health, safety, and welfare, because in today's oil and gas world, that's where the money is.
100%. And without a social license to operate, these companies cannot do business. In particular, with the new regulatory environment that we have, you compare that against what we had even 10 years ago, it is much more robust.
Yep. No, there's been a lot of work that has been done, not just on the, you know, engineering and innovation and, you know, geology side of things in the industry. You've seen in Colorado the last 10 to 15 years a tremendous amount of work being done on the regulatory side of things. An effort that really sort of began with the Ritter administration in the mid-2000s. That started a process of overhauling the way oil and gas is regulated in Colorado, to the point that it is held up as a model for the rest of the country. Any state that is looking to toughen its regulations or tighten requirements is always looking first to what Colorado is doing for ideas of how they can make their regulations more stringent. And even during the Obama administration, you really saw the Obama EPA looking to what Colorado was doing as they wanted to you know, toughen the regulatory playing field for oil and gas.
And that's a national, nonpartisan view. And back to 2013, when the methane regulations, you might go to a group like the Environmental Defense Fund that would tell you that as a result of those regulations, Colorado had the toughest regulations on that issue. And countries come to the U.S., they come right here to Colorado to emulate or copy our regulations. I think many people think that these are the most responsive regulations in the world. So we really ought to be proud for what we have. But what we have would be dismantled substantially if 112 were to pass. So before we get into that, yeah. And let me just do, you talked about the business leaders that Vital for Colorado built, and people may not know who or what Vital for Colorado is. Let me just give a shameless plug here, and also really kind of focus on who is running the organization, the board of directors. I feel very fortunate that we've assembled this board. We're a nonprofit group that started in summer of 2013. We advocate what we call responsible energy policy, and our main goal really is to try to keep the energy industry vital in the state, but also to recognize the economic impact, also recognize what I just said about the responsive and changing evolutionary nature of the regulatory system that we have. We're not trying to pick winners or losers. We're just trying to prevent this industry from being unfairly tossed out. We have a 7-point principle, which is our organizing pledge. I think we're lucky enough now to have 88,000 Colorado citizens have signed it, over 1,000 businesses. And among the principles would be principles such as we believe in fact, not hyperbole. And we want science to lead us. to the correct results. And then back to our board of directors, we have CEOs, presidents of these organizations. This is off the top of my head, so John, please feel free to jump in if I miss an important one. But we have the Aurora Chamber, we have the South Denver Metro Chamber, we have the State Chamber of Commerce, we have Colorado Business Roundtable, we have the City of Glendale, we have
Cap Logistics,
very important national company which transports to industry all around the world, really, 185 countries. We have one of the largest, if not the largest, real estate concerns, senior vice president of that firm. We have a lawyer who's in the mining industry, not the oil and gas industry. She's really a safety lawyer. OSHA, MSHA, those kind of things.
I heard you mention concern. We have to mention Colorado Concern.
Colorado Concern, very, very important organization. And these are the leaders of Vote for Colorado, and a few of them have had predecessors going back. But, you know, people say, well, Vote for Colorado is this and Vote for Colorado is that. This is what Vote for Colorado is. And if you want to see who runs the board of directors, go to www.voteforcolorado.com. So, Simon, I'm very happy that you're with us, number one, and I'm happy that you're here because you're fulfilling one of our major missions, which is we believe in facts, not hyperbole. Mm-hmm. You're a fact guy. And you're well trained to be our fact guy. Mm-hmm. And I'm happy we have somebody who's careful.
Oh, thank you.
So what is Proposition 112?
Okay. Well, so Proposition 112 is a ballot measure that voters will see on their ballot in the fall. There's the way that the proponents want you to think about Proposition 112, and then there's the way Proposition 112 actually works in practice. So what you'll hear from the proponents of Proposition 112 is that this ballot measure would just push drilling new oil and gas wells 2,500 feet further away in one direction, basically, from any nearby occupied structures, any nearby homes.
Or vulnerable areas.
Well,
and that's where the fine print comes in. That's right.
And they don't tend to mention that quite as much as they do occupied homes.
Right.
They especially don't mention the fact that the definition of vulnerable areas is to be determined in the future.
Right.
Right.
Well, so we'll pass this, and like one of our famous politicians said, that we need to pass it to read it.
Right. Well, and so look, the reason why the measure is crafted the way it is that the groups behind Proposition 112 are national, ban fracking, ban oil and gas everywhere groups.
Keep it in the ground.
Keep it in the ground. That's what they exist to do. The only public policy they support is a total ban on energy sources that they don't like, and that is increasingly zeroed in on oil and gas.
So people don't think we're talking about black helicopters or anything like that. Who are the people? Which organizations specifically?
The two big ones, there have been a lot of different groups that have been sort of here in Colorado since about 2012, but the two big ones this year are Food and Water Watch and 350.org. There's also the Sierra Club and Greenpeace as well, and they were very visible in the last ballot measure that we saw with a 2,500-foot setback. That was in 2016, and that one actually failed to make the ballot because there was such little support for it. But these are groups that came to Colorado. They were determined to pass a ban in a major energy-producing state because if they want to shut down the oil and gas industry nationally, they're going to need to do it on a state-by-state basis. And to date, they have not been able to actually convince a state that has a robust energy sector to ban it, to shut it down. They started with a series of local bans back in 2012 and 2013, and they were all primed to put a ban on the ballot statewide, and then they saw how that polls, and it polls terribly. Because no matter how you might feel about the oil and gas industry, and no matter how you might feel about issues of regulation and taxation and where you sit on the political spectrum, the vast majority of Coloradans understand that we're a major energy producing state,
and that we derive a lot of benefits from producing so much of our own energy here.
Right.
And
for instance, lower home heating costs. On average, 23% less than the national average, which translates to about $1,200 in disposable income. That's for every family in Colorado.
Right.
And that is because we are not importing it. We are getting it locally, and that translates directly into savings. There's also tax benefits. The oil and gas industry pays a lot in taxes. We'll get into that more as we go along, I'm certain. But to ban it outright, when you use that language, absolutely. Most people see right through that. They go, whoa, I don't want to ban it.
Right.
I may not like everything about the oil and gas industry, but I don't want it gone.
Right. And
so Simon, you mentioned bans didn't poll very well. How have bans done in the courts, Colorado Supreme Court in particular?
Sure. No, the local bans that were pushed in a number of cities, basically in Boulder and the suburbs of Boulder for the most part, were overturned by the state Supreme Court because they were found to be, unlawful and unconstitutional. And so the groups that are trying to...
Which, by the way, just to interject, is a precedent that goes back to 1992.
Yeah,
when
that's right.
The city of Greeley actually tried to do this. Greeley, of all places, which you wouldn't necessarily expect, but this was nearly 30 years ago at this point, 25 years ago.
Right.
And they tried this, and they said, no, you can't just ban it.
Right.
Like, there are regulations and there are mitigations that you can put in. Greeley goes, okay, we can't ban it. Let's figure out how we can work with it. And now Greeley is thriving, largely because of the oil and gas industry, coupled with ag and other industries that they have, but oil and gas is a main driver there.
And Greeley is a major sort of stronghold of pro-oil and gas sentiment, pro-energy sentiment in Colorado. In fact, just last night, the Greeley City Council passed a resolution opposing Proposition 112, and the Weld County Commission a couple of weeks before that passed a resolution also strenuously opposing Proposition 112 because they know what it would do to their local economy. But we were talking about sort of the objective of these groups being to ban oil and gas development statewide, but they can't put that in a ballot measure because they know it would be, defeated by a huge margin.
Yeah. And it's unconstitutional.
Right.
And so instead, they have pivoted to what are basically effective bans, and what they've focused on this year is this 2,500-foot setback. And the way that this actually works in practice is that they want you to think that it's a 2,500-foot setback in just one direction, just somewhere over there, further away from a house or a residential neighborhood,
into the hinterlands, at least a half mile away.
Just 2,500 feet over there somewhere. But that's not how setbacks work. It's a 2,500-foot, a half-mile setback in all directions around a single location.
So it's a circle.
So it's a circle. So just one of these setbacks is a 450-acre circle. It's a 450-acre drilling ban. And what Proposition 112 does in the fine print is that it actually applies that same drilling ban well outside of residential areas in far-flung parts of the state where it's very rural and sparsely populated. And so when the Hickenlooper administration did its analysis of the text of the fine print of Proposition 112, they found that it would create a drilling ban that covers 85% of state and private land in Colorado, which would effectively drive the oil and gas industry out of the state. So it's the ban that these groups have been seeking all along, but it's not actually, but they're able to keep that under wraps until after the election. That's kind of the strategy of the play here.
And the 85% is really, if you take the whole state altogether, if you look at the areas where there's development happening, especially in the West Coast, in the western part of Colorado, it gets in the high 90s, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, and the Hickenlooper administration's analysis is, it's very detailed, and basically what they've concluded is that there's the size of the total size of the drilling area of the drilling ban, I should say, and this is a minimum because there are some limitations with the data that they have, is 36 million acres, and the
Out of how many in Colorado?
But here's the thing: the size of the band, the 36 million acres, 35 million acres, meets that vulnerable areas definition, and vulnerable areas don't have anything to do with occupied structures. The vulnerable areas include things like irrigation ditches and intermittent streams and perennial streams, basically dry creeks, and all these other kind of land and water features that are prolific in rural parts of the state. And so what happens is all of the messaging on Proposition 112 is focused on occupied structures, but the real effect of the ballot measure, the real damage that it does to the state's energy sector, is places where people don't live. It's the rural and sparsely populated areas, and it basically says to farmers and ranchers and these rural communities that are supportive of oil and gas development, that they can't have it there because there's no flexibility in this measure at all. And you don't have to take Vital for Colorado's word for it, or the Colorado Oil and Gas Association's word for it, or the business community's word for it. The extent of the ban is so obvious and so transparent to people who have been following the activities of these groups for so long that even Congressman Jared Polis says that it's an effective ban on the state's oil and gas industry, and that's why he opposes it. He's voting no, and that's why Walker Stapleton, the Republican nominee for governor, he also opposes it. It may be actually the one issue that these two very different candidates who have very different views on energy policy in general, it may be the one issue that they actually agree on.
Right.
I think all of us were at a speech by Representative Polis in August, I think it was.
Yes, sir.
About 500 or 600 people, and he gave a speech in this point, and he said what you just said, and he said why he said that, and I think he was tried to be shouted down by 3 or 4 people from his own party because they didn't want him to say it. I mean, I was shocked. I'm sitting there going, holy cow, you just nominated this guy, and he's pretty articulate. He's here. He's saying these things really to probably a somewhat skeptical crowd.
Yeah.
But he's doing so and he's being shouted down by his own party.
Well, it speaks volumes when someone like Congressman Polis, who, for your listeners who maybe haven't followed this as closely, in 2014 he financially supported, to the tune of millions of dollars, anti-oil and gas ballot measures. And he very wisely pulled those from the ballot once he saw the bipartisan wave of opposition, coming his way, coming the way of those ballot measures. And instead, he and Governor Hickenlooper put together an oil and gas task force and an engagement process to kind of bring all of the different stakeholders together to find ways to improve the relationship between sort of state regulators and local governments and oil and gas developers, and it's been very successful.
Which is a testament to the way that we do business in Colorado as well. The oil and gas industry has undergone something like 15 rulemakings in the last 10 years in response to changing community needs, changing operating practices, changing interactions with local governments. The oil and gas industry is very responsive in this regard. It doesn't really get any credit for it, but is now subject to a potential ban.
Yeah, that's right. The way that oil and gas is regulated, as I think we've talked about a little bit earlier.
So we'll probably have to summarize this in the next segment, but I know you've done a study of this in terms of all of the changes, I think going back to 2005 or 2008.
Yeah.
And that's kind of illuminating to demonstrate how flexible the system really is.
Yeah, it started under Governor Bill Ritter, and Governor Bill Ritter has said that Colorado's oil and gas regulations really are the toughest in the country, and they're a model for the rest of the nation.
So we'll go through a summary of that at next segment. John?
Fantastic. Stay tuned. We've got more with Simon Lomax coming up here in the next segment. If you want to hear this episode, as well as every episode that we've done on Vital for Colorado Radio, go to vitalforcolorado.com. Under the Learn tab, videos and podcasts. We'll be back in a bit. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us here on Vital for Colorado Radio. I'm your on-air producer, Jon Ekstrom. Peter Moore is our host, also chairman and CEO of Vital. Peter.
Well, thanks a lot, John. We have Simon Lomax, who's the Vital for Colorado Research Fellow. And during our last segment, you were talking about the definition of vulnerable areas, which is one of the phrases in this statutory measure that's before the voters this fall. And I just wanted to explain that it's, I think, even more expansive, because it's not what currently is defined as being vulnerable. Am I correct in saying that it's any area designated as being vulnerable in the future by a local government, which could be anything? I sort of think of a devil's playground that way.
Yeah, it is an extremely open-ended definition that applies to an already sweeping ban. Again, banning oil and gas drilling in areas where you don't have populated areas at all. And then any local government could come in after the fact and do two things under Proposition 112 that really could be very damaging and isn't factored into the economic analyses that have been done so far. The first is adding on more vulnerable areas. Any local government, any local official, any state agency could just add new areas at will and impose that half-mile drilling ban within anything that meets that description. And then also, and this hasn't been talked about very much at all, local officials in any part of the state could extend the setback well beyond half a mile. They could extend it to infinity. It doesn't allow them to reduce it below half a mile, but it allows them to increase it as far as they want. None of that, none of the consequences of that have been factored into the economic analyses on Proposition 112.
And can you tell us about that? What's at stake here?
Well, right, sure. So we talked earlier about the Hickenlooper administration's analysis showing that Proposition 112 imposes a drilling ban covering 85% of state and private land. So using that analysis as a starting point, some of the state's top business groups, most respected business groups, commissioned an economic analysis and brought in experts at the Colorado School of Mines to review it to make sure that the methodology and the findings were sound. And the findings of this economic analysis are truly astonishing. We are talking about, if Proposition 112 passes, almost 150,000 jobs being lost from the Colorado economy. And some people might think, well, I guess that's just oil and gas. Mm-hmm. No, it's not. The analysis finds that because the Colorado oil and gas sector, which is, a $30 billion industry, $31 billion industry, is so interconnected with every other sector of our state economy, that what happens is, if that industry is driven out of the state, most of those 150,000 jobs that are lost will take place outside of the oil and gas sector completely. I actually can point you to a real-world example of that. I was in Colorado Springs last week talking to people in the manufacturing sector in that city, because even though Colorado Springs is a long way away from Weld County, and it's also a long distance from the Raton Basin in the southeast of the state. That's also an oil and gas producing area. They make a lot of oil and gas equipment, especially the manufacturing sector. And I was talking to the owner of Springs Fabrication, a gentleman by the name of Tom Nepple, and he has about 150 employees. And he is very concerned about what would happen to his business in the manufacturing sector if Proposition 112 were to pass. Because every day, welders and machinists come to his plant to work on equipment that is made for oil and gas development, up in Weld County or over on the western slope, or down in the Raton Basin, and all of that goes away if Proposition 112 is passed.
That's a pronounced ripple effect.
That's right. And so when you look at this is one of the reasons why, if you go to vitalforcolorado.com and you look at the drop-down, no on 112 and opposition to 112, you will see this massive list of chambers of commerce and local governments and trade associations. Exactly. Thank you, John. These are people who are in. These are people from all across the economy, all across different sectors, at local governments as well, mayors, and a whole host of elected officials.
Well, and what's remarkable is this is a bipartisan collection of mayors.
Yes, it is.
Denver Mayor Michael Hancock, Colorado Springs Mayor John Suthers, Aurora Mayor Bob Laguerre.
Right.
I mean, all the way up and down the 85 corridor, which you'd expect, which you see a lot of oil and gas service companies, oil and gas companies themselves.
Right.
Eaton, Evans, Fort Lupton, Greeley, Hudson. But, you know, you see this in places like Thornton as well, or Glendale, or Centennial.
Or also
Right.
Windsor.
Right.
Windsor.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, it's proof positive that people get that energy is an important sector. It's a critical sector to the health of the overall Colorado economy. And once they understand the facts behind Proposition 112, once they see the fine print, read it, understand its implications, look at the analysis that the Hickenlooper administration has done, and look at things like Congressman Jared Polis is saying about the measure, as well as Walker Stapleton and others, they realize that it is not about health and safety like the proponents claim it is. They understand that it is about driving a critical economic sector in Colorado totally out of the state, and that's why you see so much pushback from across the political spectrum and across the economy.
And I'm not sure what you know from these studies, but the implication of removing this economic activity from the state of Colorado and to displacing, firing this many workers over such a long and sustained time period, I think is an economic recession or depression the state's never seen. I mean, I've been here since '78, and I've seen too many to even recount. But this is of a greater magnitude and scale.
Yes, sir.
Just in terms of the list, I would urge people to go to the Vital for Colorado website and take a look at the list. It's broken down by associations, mayors, and elected officials. And I haven't done an exact count, but I believe, and this may attitude every single day, I believe we over 60 associations. I think we have over 25 mayors. I think we have over 50 elected officials. And if you take a look at it, you'll see that it's bipartisan, just as it is at the gubernatorial level.
Yes.
Anybody who understands what the real impact is against it.
Yes, sir.
And then on Colorado Springs, I'm just looking at an article that was published just, it was updated just a couple days ago at the Colorado Springs Gazette. And this involves a company run by Heidi Gill in Colorado Springs.
Yes, sir.
And she explains one of the manufacturing jobs in Colorado Springs, and they manufacture sound walls. And so this is technology that's for health and safety and welfare, really. And
Yes,
this
sir.
is part of the innovation that's been happening. And she just says that this will drive her company out of the state. Period.
Yes, sir.
No ifs, ands, or buts. And so those 50 people, then all the people that depend upon those 50 people, then it goes on and on. Then we get into, eventually, if you start thinking of all the people that are impacted, you might come up with a number like 240, 250,000 people, because, and not all of them are, 100% impact, but all of those people are impacted because of the multiplier effect, the M1 factor, because the people in the oil and gas industry are so well paid, their spending dollars are discretionary and count more.
Yes, sir.
And somebody's just getting by. And so that's what this study that you're talking about by the Common Sense Policy Roundtable, which is also on our website, points out. And
Yes,
it
sir.
uses a methodology that's followed throughout the state, actually throughout the country, and has been for over 20 years. It's called a REMI study, to figure out the impact on local government and taxes of economic events.
Yep.
That's what this is.
That's right. And, one of the really unfortunate aspects of the Yes on Prop 112 campaign, the anti-oil and gas campaign, is how they have really tried to diminish the importance of the energy sector, and especially the energy jobs. At every turn, they try to argue that not that many people in Colorado are employed in oil and gas.
Right.
And they try to basically say, well, we think the number is only 30,000, as if somehow it's okay, even if it was 30,000, for 30,000 jobs to be eliminated in the state of Colorado.
Just blinked out like Thanos.
Yes, and just because of a politically motivated ballot measure that is really being driven by national groups looking to make a political statement against the oil and gas industry.
Well, and Simon, I'd like to pivot right here because this is being sold as a health and safety measure.
Yes, sir.
And one of the things that you hear is there are increased poor health outcomes for people who live near oil and gas operations. And that's simply untrue. The studies that they are based upon come from the Colorado School of Public Health. Lisa McKenzie is the lead researcher.
Right.
And that study has been since disavowed and debunked by the Colorado Department of Health and Environment, the top health regulator in the entire state.
Yeah.
Can you expand upon that?
Yeah, I think it's an important thing to sort of tackle head on. So the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, just like public health regulators you find in every other state, their mission is to protect public health and safety, and these agencies are staffed with people who are public health experts and public servants who've dedicated their careers to public safety, and their job is to constantly monitor the effectiveness of existing regulations and where needed, find room for improvement. And also their job is to sort through all of the kind of competing claims that are made by all sides in any kind of contentious debate. And oil and gas is no different. And so what they have consistently found in a series of reports and statements is that the current 500 to 1,000 foot setback is protective of public health. And it's funny that you mention Lisa McKenzie, because the most recent paper from Dr. Lisa McKenzie examined emissions inside of a 500 foot radius, so a shorter distance than the current statewide setback, the minimum setback. And, what the CDPHE found, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment found, was that the findings of that paper actually confirmed what they had been saying all along. That their own measurements, thousands upon thousands of measurements, plus a review...
Like 10,000 air samples, right?
That's right. And then reviewing not just their own data, but reviewing like a dozen different epidemiological studies that have been conducted, nationwide. They've looked at the data in an even-handed, detached way, and they have come back and said the 500-foot to 1,000-foot setback is protecting public health and safety, and the claims that are made to the contrary just aren't supported by the facts. And I guess the thing about Proposition 112 you have to remember is that, they're trying to argue that 2,500 feet is justified. And if the public health experts are saying, no, actually 500 to 1,000 feet is protective of public health, then there's absolutely no basis at all for them to be claiming that 2,500 feet should be the number. And once you start to kind of, unravel the deceptive packaging, once you begin to sift through the talking points that are designed just to, frankly, scare people into supporting, a political agenda that is going to hurt their economic interests, what you find is that 2,500 feet and the use of these vulnerable areas was really just a calculated effort to get a de facto ban in place without having to actually tell voters that's what your plan was all along.
Well, and two things here that I'd like to just respond to. One is that we're talking about the CDPHE. This is not an industry group. This is not funded by industry. It's funded by the taxpayers.
Right.
They have no allegiance to the oil and gas industry. They have no agenda as
And these are career people. They're not political appointees.
No.
They're health people.
Right.
These are health people working in the field of public health nothing more. So that's something important to remember, because they will get painted sometimes as being in the pocket of industry. Nothing is further from the truth.
Again, one of the really unfortunate things about Proposition 112 and this whole anti-oil and gas campaign that we've seen in Colorado, in a really kind of, high-profile way since about, 2012 or 2013, is that for as much as the oil and gas sector, as much as the energy sector, as much as energy workers are under attack from these groups, the public servants who work at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment and the Colorado Department of Natural Resources are just as much, if not more, under attack by these ideologically motivated groups. If you have ever gone to a Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission hearing where these groups will, mobilize and show up, they will line up at the microphone and they will, they will yell and scream and accuse these professional regulators, these professional regulators, and the staff that work for the COGCC. They will accuse them of just the most horrid things. And I guess we talked a little bit earlier about how much how much regulation of oil and gas has changed, and how much tougher and tighter and how much more scrutiny has been applied since the Ritter administration in 2007 and onwards. And the difference, what that process shows, the number of rulemakings and the legislative action that's happened, what it shows is that the public health and safety regulators do respond to issues that are brought to their attention. They do act. They do answer concerns that are raised by the public. And what Proposition 112 basically is, it is basically proof that the anti-oil and gas groups, because they don't get the kind of answer they want from the professionals who have to deal in data and science and the law, because they don't like the answer they've gotten, they're now just going to try to completely go around and do an end run around the people whose careers, whose lives are dedicated to protecting public health and safety.
And they start with the ad hominems.
Just a couple of quick points. The study you're talking about is a very recent study. It's a 2017 study, and one of the major findings is that within the current setbacks, which again are generally speaking 500 or 1,000 feet, depending upon what kind of a high occupancy structure you might be dealing with, that there's no substantial or moderate evidence of health effects of communities living near oil and gas operations. That's what State Colorado says, and it's what it actually has said for quite some time. But this is a very serious study, which is on our website. And as you say, that's not a convenient statement. So now we're going to attack the Colorado Department of Health.
Right.
And then one more thing, just I feel obligated to mention this as a lawyer, that this new language effectively takes away, for people that are applying for whatever might be left, I guess that's the 15% that's left, of application and hearing process, and what lawyers would say that's due process, would take that away because you can't consider it because of this new superseding statutory language. So it essentially emasculates the current system, which has been in effect, and you and I did a study on this a few months ago. Actually, I just read it and you wrote it. But of all of the efforts that have been made by the COGCC in response to environmental health and safety concerns for at least the last 10 years, it would take all that away because you can't do that anymore.
Right, and environmental groups were actively involved and at the table with regulators and with the industry, and sometimes these were very controversial rulemakings that the industry didn't like, and sometimes the environmental groups didn't like what the regulators were doing. But
at the time, like frac fluid disclosure.
Yeah, exactly.
At the time, it was great. At the time, it said, holy cow, this system that allows input, due process, hearing and input, and science and facts, love it.
Well, and it also shows that the system that we have in Colorado is very open to constructive criticism and constructive input from environmental groups or industry groups or the business community or anybody who has something at stake. But again, Proposition 112 isn't about improving the system we have. It's about throwing the system out of the window so that what you're left with is an effective ban on one of the state's most important economic sectors. That's all it really is about. And but in order to work that out, you have to look past the talking points of these groups, and you have to look to what the business community is saying. You have to look to what Congressman Polis is saying, and State Treasurer Walker Stapleton is saying, and Mayor Michael Hancock of Denver is saying. People who understand what actually makes the Colorado state economy work, and people who understand how the oil and gas industry in Colorado actually works. And they know an attempt to ban a whole sector of our economy when they see it.
Right.
And they are sounding the alarm, and they are saying, vote no on 112.
I shouldn't ask this when I only have 3 minutes left, but let's go back to Representative Polis. He quite honestly, is probably one of the most progressive politicians in America. And he won the nod for governorship candidate this time around, and he says it's a ban and a bad idea. We've talked about the numbers. We talked about the number of people. We talked about how do we get to this place? How could this possibly have gotten on the ballot? And what, 170,000 people signed it? I guess that's how I got on the ballot. But I guess what are your thoughts with a larger question? How do we get here?
Look, I think that Colorado has a big target, has been a big target of national anti-oil and gas groups for a long time. If you look at the places where these groups have been successful, it's been in places where there isn't actually an established industry. In New York, for example, the biggest success they've had was banning, Marcellus shale development in New York State.
Right.
And the way they did that was not by banning an industry that was already in place. They prevented that industry from being able to start. And what's really interesting about what happened in New York is that it was the same thing. The state regulators concluded on at least 2 occasions with these really comprehensive environmental impact analyses that they could develop shale gas in New York safely under a stringent set of regulations that were written, but the regulators were never actually allowed to do their work. They were never allowed to actually process a single permit application, because there was this indefinite moratorium put on permitting, and then Governor Cuomo came in and made it official and made it a ban. The reason why we keep seeing this activism in Colorado is because this is being driven by national groups that want to make a statement against the oil and gas industry. But for their campaign to escalate, they have to be able to convince a state that's a major energy producer to shut down energy production.
Okay, so how do we stop that, and how can people get involved?
Sure. Well, most important, make sure you're registered to vote, make sure you update your registration, and make sure that you go all the way down the ballot and that you vote no on Proposition 112. That's incredibly important. It doesn't matter.
Number one.
Doesn't matter how you're voting in other races or other ballot measures. The opposition to this is so broad and so bipartisan that no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, no matter what you do for a living, where you are in the economy, this affects you, and you need to vote no.
And talk to your neighbors and friends about it too.
Yes, sir.
And Peter, where can we find Vital for Colorado?
www.vitalforcolorado.com.
Fantastic. We're also on Facebook. We're on Twitter. If you want to hear this episode as well as every episode that we have in Vital for Colorado's history, go to vitalforcolorado.com, as Peter just laid out for you. Under the Learn tab, videos and podcasts, we have a number of resources. We haven't even touched on the State Land Board and education funding, but there are a lot of resources on Vital for Colorado. Get educated. Vote no on Proposition 112. Peter Moore, Simon Lomax, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Todd.